What's good with YouTube? You already know. Real Talk with Flacco, and this is Flacco himself coming live and direct. And on this platform, what do? We dive into sensitive issues, delicate matters concerning gangs, prison, community, recidivism, addiction, and any other title I feel worthy at this moment. And so on this one, man, what we're going to do is we're going to do a detailed account of Nuestra Familia history. I'm going to try to give you guys as thorough and elaborated breakdown with no biased opinions or perspectives on what I'm about to break down. A lot of this could be backed up with documents, as well as personal one-on-one interviews and so forth with past members from both sides. So I'm gonna get to it right now. Okay, in the beginning, there was a domestic mafia. Was established first and foremost, and it was established somewhere between 1955 and 57. Most people give it the date of 1957. And it was established by an individual named Weddle Bluff Flores from Hawaiian Gardens, who had the vision of creating a super gang. His belief was that he could recruit all those that were basically what you would call beasts at that time, savages, gangsters from the revolving areas in Los Angeles at that time, from all the gangs. It wasn't just anybody. It had to be someone that was with the business, that was about that action. And in uniting these forces, man, the goal was to basically, some say that they weren't there to protect, what I'm saying, or against other inmates. But I always believe, regardless of what that feeling is, in order for you to do what you want to do on these yards, you got to have numbers to be able to protect your own people. And so this became a very powerful group. They were young at this time, though. Don't get it twisted. A lot of them got spread out to prison. The recruitment was very selective. You had to be the cream of the crop. You had to have your padrino and so forth and be brought on with a vote by all members at that facility at that time. And I believe every member had to have a vote at that time. And they've always lived by that mantra. And so, as they became more powerful in the system, what I'm saying? There's a story about Cheyenne when he hit the system, and I forgot what year, but he touched down on San Quentin. And that some 6'5", 300-pound black guy said that he was going to make him his woman and try to give him a kiss. Later on that day, Cheyenne killed him in front of the whole yard to make a point. That's something that's been put out there for years, and that's something about the notoriety of who Cheyenne was and the recognition of him. Then you had other inmates like Kilroy, Alfie Sosa. All these individuals have been around. They came in the system during different time years, but around 1961 is where that basically the basic rules for the inmates started to change course, and the oath was more taken, and it was more higher expectations within this particular group. And with that, they became a very powerful force to be reckoned with. And when you become powerful, what ends up happening? You end up turning on basically on your own. And see, from there was a lot of situations and scenarios to where you would call what they call MA oppression. MA aggression and so forth started to take advantage of raza from all different areas. It had nothing to do with north or south, because at that time you already had a few members that were from up north, like Hatchet, Ison. Everybody knows who he is from San Fran, a straight beast, a straight killer. But as this group started to evolve, say you were from up north or down south, and you were from just trying to do your time, you were a regular convict, but you weren't, with that action. You know what I'm saying? They used to put you in situations to where, hey, you'd have to, pay taxes on the yard. You would have to bring in dope for the organization. You'd have to do this and that. And see, that was employed to target certain individuals that could be beneficial. There's speculation and rumors that, even they used to snatch up punks that were Raza, you know what I'm saying? Or turn them into punks. And basically, see, the Raza was getting oppressed. And see, this was going on for years. And the foresight of the inmate was that, we're always going to be superior to everybody else. If you're not on our level, then you're not with us. You know what I'm saying? Therefore, you could be taken advantage of. And so MA oppression and aggression gave birth to what you would call the NFM at that time, which was called the Nuestra Familia Mexicana, which was the original NF at that time. It wasn't called Nuestra Familia. And they were starting to note this as the blooming flower. What's interesting about this is, I don't know what year it was, but somewhere around the areas of 1965 to 1967, the first NFM Constitution was created with the assistance of a MA member from Mafia named Luis Araujo. I think that's how you pronounce his name, who was from Mafia, but a Mexican Mafia member. And see, the initial leaders was an individual named Little John Valdez from Little Valley. He was the first padre at first. Then you had the officers under him, which would be like Chalo Hernandez, who was a cousin to Cheyenne Cadena. Trip on that. So you had one that was a very influential MA member, Cheyenne. Then you had one that was a very influential NF member, you know what I'm saying, Chalo. And Chalo was more of a revolutionary about the cause. He had created a lot of things within the organization at that time. And one of the things that he created was a newsletter at San Quentin, which at first it was called Azteca or Aztlan, and it changed names. And it was a COVID operation as far as for the Raza to try to recruit those under the Blooming Flower to stand against MA aggression. So they used to meet, to do their work and so forth. And I think once a week or twice a week. And there they used to strategize about how they were going to push this NFM and stand against MA aggression. Other members at that time was Juan Lips Valdez from Big Bassett, who ended up taking over the Padre position from Little John. Bruce Weddle Morgan from Clanton. Freddie Woofy from San Diego. These are all individuals that had became influential NFM, or what you would call sometimes the CDC said as Blooming Flower, which means that they were just slowly on the rise. Now there was skirmishes left here and there in these facilities like Soledad and San Quentin, but never to the extreme level of violence. You know what I'm saying? The MA wasn't really taking the NFM serious at that time because the NFM's agenda wasn't really pushed out there. And we're going to get into how that started to create right now. So at this point, man, those two major issues created this ongoing conflict, as well as there's going to be some other instances you're going to hear. But it all started basically with one individual first and foremost, which was an individual named Sonny Pena, who used to be a drug dealer. He used to work for the Mexican Mafia. He quit paying his dues. They ended up killing him. Now, Sonny was from Maravilla in New Mexico. So he had a lot of ties to the Maravilla area. So there was a lot of Maravilla individuals that were upset about this killing, including one, Luis Araujo, who was a Mexican Mafia member, but a sympathizer to the NFM, believe it or not. Now, the next incident happened in March of 1968. And this is when an individual named Philip Rebel Neri from Bakersfield ended up being stabbed and hit. Now, Rebel was very close to Chalo Hernandez, who was Cheyenne Cadena's cousin. Now, the interesting thing about this was Rebel used to date Cheyenne Cadena's sister, and Cheyenne used to date his sister. But this whole hit didn't sit well, especially with Chalo. And this is where he started pushing the issue that, hey, they're not going to victimize our raza no more. This isn't going to be tolerated. We're going to end up having to take a stand if this continues. And this is where he was transferred at that time to San Quentin. Now, even though he wasn't the first padre, right? He was a very influential NFM member, but he had a very radical outlook on things, and he was very much into the culture thing. And this is where they started to plan and strategize, and they had the Azteca newsletter, which was a COVID operation to recruit people into what you call the Blooming Flower at that time because they were starting to bloom. And that's when they came up with a mandate that the NFM would be a commitment for life. At that time, they had over 24 members, and I think the majority of them decided to walk away. But they were still able to continue to recruit people who believed in what they were doing at that time. And this is when the incident starts to get really serious. Around December 14th, 1968, okay, there was an individual named Mad Dog Padilla. Now, he had his boots taken like days earlier by an individual named Carlos Pieface Ortega. Now, there's different speculation whether he loaned them or Pieface just took them. But eventually, he seen Robot Salas wearing these boots and confronted him all drunk. Robot kind of just ignored it at first. Later on, though, Mad Dog continued to push the issue about those boots, calling him a thief and so forth. In the process, Robot Salas ended up stabbing him on one of the tiers. And from there, Mad Dog Celly Manito intervened. Now, this is what they call the issue, the straw that broke the camel's back. This is when the NFM said, this is what we've been waiting for to take this stand against the MA. They're not going to be victimizing our gente no more. And this is where they decided to take a stand. They put up together a plan to where the next day, because a lot of the MA members were getting drunk and high because it was Mexican Independence Week. So a lot of these NFM members and associates all wore gray sweaters to identify themselves. They staged attack on the MA, And from there, the conclusion of that was there was 23 inmates, I believe, that were stabbed on both sides. The Mexican Mafia pretty much got the bad end of it. There was only 4 members at that time there, like Dati was there and Frog and so forth. But at the end, there was one MA associate, according to Mexican Mafia members, named Cricket Gallegos from Diamond Street, that was killed. But a lot of also CDC claimed that he was a Mexican Mafia member. So, I'm gonna lean on the side that he was just an associate, because there's nothing that tells me different. I'm gonna respect what former Mexican Mafia members say. But this was the declaration of war between the NFM and the Mexican Mafia. From there, all the MA members, some that were in adjustment center, were moved out. They were transferred to Folsom, where they started to restructure and reestablish. A lot of the NFM members either maintained there on that yard, or they got transferred to Soledad. And this is where the 4-year war started to take place. Now, you hear me say the 4-year war, also known as the 5-year war in our history, from 1968 to 72. They used to call it the 5-year war. But I call it 4 years because there was basically a proposed truce that was going on in 1971. See, after the all-out blitz, there was a lot of tick-for-tack hits and murders and so forth between NFM associates, members, and MA members and associates. It's hard for me to substantiate any type of claim of who was who at that time, but it was a bloody time in the prison system. So around 1972, April 21st, for everything's changed course, where you had 2 AB members named Fred Madrin and Donald Hale, who ended up hitting an individual and killing Fred Charlie Castillo in Chino State Prison. Okay, shortly after that, on I want to say, I think it was July 11th, I believe, 1972, Juan Lips Valdez from Big Bassett, who was also at that time considered the NF Padre, was hit by Beaver and Ronnie Salazar from the Mexican Mafia. Shortly after that, around July, I believe, 21st, an individual named Jesse Bozo Rancheria, who was an NF member out of Orange County, was also killed on behalf of the AB, doing their bidding once again for the Mexican Mafia. Now, right after the Lips hit happened, you had an NF member on July 21st, I want to say 1972, in LA County Jail. You had Jesse Bozo Castro Rancheria from Orange County, who was an NF member, like I said, was killed by the AB on behalf of the Mexican Mafia. In retaliation for that hit, shortly thereafter, an MA member named Robert Batcat Zapata from Big Bassett was killed by an NF member named Daniel Pollo or Chicken Legs Lozoya from Chino. This hit occurred in Chino State Prison. Batcat was murdered. So I know there's a lot of different discrepancies about how many NF-MA members confirmed hits. This is actually a confirmed hit, man. And the NF take credit for this one. As I've talked to numerous people who were NF members at that time, they said Chicken Legs was actually an NF member at that time. Now, shortly after this, you had another incident where you had James Lugo, who was killed on behalf of both AB and Mexican Mafia members in September. And this is where the term "send him to Lugo's pad" came about. You also had another hit that occurred out there in Tehachapi, when the individual Richard Bullwinkle Medina, who was an NF member, was killed by Mexican Mafia members. He was killed because he had previously killed an MA associate that was from Maravilla. Then you had the incident that happened in Susanville, where you had Pelon Moreno. The Morenos are a very well-established Mexican Mafia family. They were out there in Sanger for a minute. They ended up killing an individual named Diamond. And see, the war is continuing. As you can see, there was a lot of NF members that were killed around that time, right? 4 or 5. A couple by the AB and a couple by the MA. And this is where the morale was down and change was needed. But at the same time, like I said, Cheyenne had started to have a new vision. Where shortly before, Cheyenne was out there, he got arrested on his way to try to take out his own cousin, Chalo Hernandez, because he was NF. The NFM has dropped the name Mexicana, and they just started to proceed to call themselves NF. And I think a lot of that had to do with Babo Sosa, because he was not Mexican, he was actually Puerto Rican. Okay, so as Cheyenne's trying to propose a 12-man council, committee, board, whatever you want. It was to mediate all issues within the state of California prisons amongst Raza. They wanted NF members and MA members on this board. A lot of MA members weren't on board with this. Peg Leg and so forth. They just, Kilroy, all these individuals did not want peace. Eventually what ended up occurring was an individual named Joker from the Mexican Mafia ended up having the Aranda brothers hit in Chino State Prison on December 12th. The Miranda brothers were NF members that were from San Bernardino. This is where the NF decided to set an example, and this is where the morale of the NF came back. On December 17th, 1972, Cheyenne came out of his cell. He had some bodyguards on him because, of course, he was of leadership position. And what ended up happening, they ended up flanking him from both sides. The main people who ended up stabbing Cheyenne were both Joker Mendoza and Manzanas from New York. As you guys already know, Joker's from Redonda. He at one time wanted to be a Mexican Mafia member, but was pretty much shot down. The other individuals that assisted at that time were Crackers Vindiola, Mad Dog, Licoso, as well as Tiny Padilla was on the bottom tier, and he ended up catching a case for this because he plunged a knife in him after Cheyenne was stabbed numerous times. There's like different accounts, whether it was 58, 72, 74, whatever. He was booked hard. They threw him over the tier. Now, there was also another MA member that was there with Cheyenne that they also threw over the tier, but he ended up living. And see, this is where everything changed the course once again, where there was no peace that was going to be on the table, because the MA vowed revenge in blood. Therefore, there would never be any type of truce. Now, not only did that hit happen, about 5 days later in DVI, an individual was actually killed. I want to say, was it Steve Haley? Was killed by NF members Glenn Hobo Holden and Fig. Now, see, within 5 days, the NF were able to kill two individuals from two different groups of organizations. This is where the morale of the NF started to come back. And this is where the change of course of where they went from there. We're going to drop the second part to the Nuestra Familia history. Another banger, man. We're going to get straight to it. I'm going to try to give as much details as far as what was going on during this time era. As you know, we left off at the end of 1972, where two very, very important incidents happened. One happened in Chino State Prison, where Cheyenne was taken out, and another one happened in DVI 5 days later, where Steve Haley, an Aryan Brotherhood member, was taken out. So at this time, in 1973, early 73, there was growing dissension about leadership within the NF. Okay, the individual who had been holding the position of leadership position, Juan Lips Valdez, was pretty much out. They had new elections and so forth, and the supreme leader at that time, who would later become known as the Nuestro General, was Babo Sosa. Lips, shortly after, from Big Bassett, who was more into the Chicano movement and the radical lines of what they were trying to push, ended up becoming a dope fiend and later debriefed to CDC. Now, Babo was recruited by Wolfie de San Diego around, I think around 67. Okay, at this time frame in 1973, they got rid of the Padrino system and they started to write a new constitution. Babo Sosa was one of them, Death Row Joe, Manzanas from New York, Black Bob, Robert Vasquez from Gilroy, who we're going to be discussing later on. But if you guys are wondering, he was the very first NF member that was ever recruited from up north. There was another individual who played a pivotal role in writing the Constitution, which was Pete Psycho Gutierrez de Fresno, who shockingly in 2008 was killed by none other than Skip in the BOP prison system. Okay, so as they structured the whole different chain of authority or chain of command, whatever you want to call it, they started to impose more regimental procedures and so forth. And a lot of the things that they tried to emulate came from what they've seen in a lot of the Italian Mafia style type of chain of commands. Now, they had captains, lieutenants, and so forth. Now, Death Row Joe ended up holding the position of first captain, which gave him a lot of authority to do things at his discretion. Now, Babo wanted to take this organization in a whole different direction. It was more about becoming financially supportive in the movement of their cause, which was to build up the organization. Therefore, they started wanting to control the rackets, not only on the inside, but on the outside. And Babo looked at himself more along the lines of a gangster, a thug. You know, he wanted this to be looked at as mob activities, which is a word that later on that they used, the mob. Okay, so around this time era, a lot of stuff was happening. A lot of issues occurred. You had tick for tack stuff that was occurring between the MA as well as the Nuestra Familia. And in fact, one of the key things that occurred was in 1974 in Tracy, when a Filipino NF member named Rodney Sharky Zero was killed by a MA associate named Spider. Now, Sharky, he plays a pivotal role in the history because he's the one that drew the NF bandana with a machete, going through the sombrero and the drips of blood, which was in homage to the death of Fred Castillo, okay, which we discussed before, who was killed by the AB along the lines of 1972, I believe. Okay, so as this occurs, there was a lot of stuff going on between the NF and MA. Eventually, they tried to separate both groups. They did the validation clampdown. Now, a couple other key issues that happened at this time was an individual by the name of, Black Jess Valenzuela from Chiques. Okay, he was trying to form a peace treaty with the MA around 1974. Now, he was hit for his transgressions as well as allegations that he was working with CDC at that time, administration flipping. Now, Black Jess was killed around 1975, and the interesting situation was there was another NF member that years later was deemed no good for trying to create the same truce sometime in the 90s between the NF and the MA, believe it or not. Okay, 1974 DVI, Robert Black Bob Vasquez, the first NF member ever made from up north, he was from Gilroy, killed an Aryan Brotherhood in DVI Tracy, which put him on a pedestal of recognition that he was rising through the ranks. This was key to the future of where he stood within the organization. Now, other hits that happened was an individual named Indio Frias de Sanjo around 1974. He was hit by Ezekiel Conejo Lopez and another individual named Flavia from Gilroy, both NF members. They took his life. Now, at this time, there's a couple key things that occurred within the organization. The Chino Sinners gained a lot of influence. Now, they had been associated with the NF all the way back to 1967 due to the relationship with Jimmy Martinez, Daniel Lozoya, and these individuals who were influential within the NF push. Now, what the NF was doing with the Chino Sinners was they were allowing them to run interference on MA activities out there in the streets, such as those that were doing the bidding and assisting of the MA, they were attacking them out there on the streets. Eventually, they ended up setting certain NF members, like old man from Fresno, Rafas, as well as Pablo Sosa personally went out there to try to restructure their aims and agenda out there on the streets. So the Chino Sinners had a big influence from like 1967 to the early 80s. Up until around, 92, they actually had one of the NF generals was Chete Rojo, who was from Chino Sinners. He was actually a general up until like around 92, 93 when he elected to flip. But anyways, the course of where the organization was going at this time was a totally different direction. They started to experiment with regiments out in the streets as far back as 74, but yet had to establish them. And see, what they were noticing were two things that they had to focus on. One, that too many members were getting out there, getting on that carga, and it was allowing them not to be productive. They didn't have any accountability to reach back and to build the organization up. So that's when they enforced a new policy, which led to the death of a lot of members, which was the no usage of fixing drugs. In addition to that, the regiment started to take course out there in the streets. And if you want to give due to one individual who had a strong influence in where the NF was going in the future, it's going to be Crackers Vindiola. Crackers Vindiola, within like a 3-year time period, was responsible for at least 28 murders. Not that he committed them, but he was a sole authority out there in the streets and had a lot of influence out there in Fresno. The Vindiola brothers were no joke. Spooky, Indio, all these cats. And they actually had ties. They were not originally from Fresno. They're originally from down south out there in Los Angeles. But they laid their home out there in Fresno, Bakersfield, and so forth. And see, this is where the NF started to focus on two things, which was cleaning the streets in prison of all hermits, which was a title that they used to give to dropouts out there in the streets. So therefore, you started to have a lot of different hits that were occurring at that time out there in the streets. They were still getting busy whacking fools in the system. Particularly DVI had a lot of fucking hits. But this started to go into other areas out there in the streets as they continued forward. Also what I haven't touched base upon were certain things that changed in with the NF structure and the captains that were put in place. Besides Death Row Joe, you had Glenn Hobo Holden, who I personally know. You had T-Bone from Salinas, R. Beltran from Salas. Who else was a captain at that time? There was a whole bunch of individuals. Conejo from Gilroy, who was actually related to Black Bob, they said, and who also, Goneo was one of the ones that put together the NF Corrido that occurred in the late 70s that they made a lot of money over, that was banned. Anyways, in addition to all this, man, you had other incidents that I've just been able to confirm and clarify just as recently as yesterday. Chol Soli, who was a Korean individual who got caught up in a case out there in San Francisco, he was actually an undercover NF member. The Garnal, Danny Moore Bumpers from Santa Barbara, who was really close to Bobo and a lot of other NF members, clarified that yesterday, said that he was an undercover C. He was running with the NF. He was taken out of one unit and put in L-Wing, and where he was threatened by a white racist individual, an Aryan. And so he came out just to defend himself, and he knew all kinds of special, martial arts and so forth. All it took was one hit to take that individual out. So I found that kind of interesting of him being an undercover. Now, in addition, a lot of the undercovers got exposed in the late 70s over that baseball incident, which involved a couple Baisas and one NF member, which was a little riot that happened out over there on DVI. In the aftermath of that, a lot of those that were considered undercover NF members were being exposed and pointed out, taken off that line. This is when you had a lot of turmoil that was occurring. Now, you also had an individual named Casper from Fresno, Casper Silva, who committed 3 murders at the age of 17 on behalf of the NF out there in the streets. He was actually recruited into the NF, had I don't know how long tenure of a career, but he was actually in the system for a minute, which led them to believe that they could recruit NF members at a young age. And they were trying to have influence in YA, believe it or not, having what you call sympathizers at that time as potential recruits. And an individual named Payaso was actually recruited into the NF. I don't know at what age he was, but his life was taken brutally. Okay. Now you had other individuals that hit the system, like Pinky. Pinky actually caught his case right there in Chino when he took out an individual right there in front of, I want to believe, a major SSU agent later on down the line. He actually committed that offense. Tibbs ended up hitting the system, and Tibbs was basically sold up hobo for many years. And one thing I've talked to about Tibbs is what I heard is that, you know, he came into the system late at an older age, Vietnam vet, but was very, very intelligent, and he paid attention and listened. So he was able to listen to the basic ideals of what the NF organization was, and ended up applying that to his life. They used to call him Jimmy. He's the one that gave himself that name, Tibbs. He gave a whole long speech I heard on the yard about, you know, this is who he's going to be and so forth. Pinky as well. Pinky has a long, extensive career, and he actually escaped from one of the county jails years ago, man, with Chente Rojo. Tex as well caught his case in Santa Barbara. They ended up hanging someone up in the unit. I believe it was a NF dropout as well. I want to say in Ventura County. So there was a lot of stuff going on at this time during the 70s, man. And this is where you see the current leadership now. They have came into the system around the late 70s. I think the oldest living member up to a year ago was Tarzan. Tarzan was recruited in 1969 in San Quentin. And there's the famous picture of, you see all the NF members, Bobo, Lips, and so forth. And you see Tarzan with a big smile. The reason why he has a smile is that's the day that he was pulled into the NF. Later on down the lines, as we'll talk, he was put up for retirement status because he was basically incommunicado in the Fed. So he's one of the very few NF members that was classified and labeled as retired. But when the brass came back in the fold, they pretty much recognized him again. You know, you had a couple hits that were very controversial out there. You had the hit of a female named Gloria Rice, who was set to testify against the NF for the killing of her man, who was a former NF member named Happy Rice. This had occurred out there in Salinas. She was sent to testify against an individual named Ernie Castro, as well as Black Jess Gomez, who ironically, Black Jess was deemed no good years later for trying to do the same thing that the Black Jess Valenzuela did from Chiquez, but trying to form a peace treaty back in the 90s. In addition to this, you had all kinds of other altercations that were occurring, both inside and outside on the streets. MA members took out a couple NF members out there in the streets. And then ended up taking an individual named Benito, who was involved in the shoe war, who at that time was sold up with Mad Dog Padilla. He was out there on the streets of East LA. He had ties to San Jose as well as Maravilla. Robot Salas, out of all people, who stabbed him years before, and the individual named Spider ended up taking him out. It's ironically that Robot Salas ended up having Spider killed years later. In addition to that, you had Woodsy Reyes from Bakersfield and his brother that were killed. Now, I can only confirm that Woodsy was an NF member. It doesn't really recognize his brother. Maybe he was a sympathizer or so what. But ended up getting set up. Mundo Mendoza and Sailor Boy were the ones that took their lives. Basically, they had a female that had an inside track on these individuals that pretty much set them up, got Mundo and them in there, and Mundo was about his business and took that action. Now, like I said, there was all kinds of other things that were occurring. I think the NF started to focus more about the control of the streets, less focused on the MA. They wanted to control their own rackets, their own territorial claims. So there was also an individual named Alejandro Knuckles Moreno, who was killed after he paroled from 1977 from Soledad. One of the Gabriel brothers was convicted of it, I believe, Art Beltran and a couple individuals. He paroled and had been doing business dealings on behalf of the MA and so forth, and had owed some money, I guess, also to the NF at that time. And basically, they tried to first give him a hot shot, right? It didn't work. So then they proceeded to stab him several times at a bus depot. This happened around 1977. The NF acknowledged him as a Mexican Mafia member. Several other individuals say that he was just an associate. As far as the ones that are on the Mexican Mafia side, I do not know. But if you read through transcripts, they had him classified and labeled as a Mexican Mafia member. At this time, you had some very serious issues that were occurring in the county jail. 1977, you had a Smiley Flores, a Casper Castro, and Brown Bob Viramontes, who would later become a future general as well, who killed an individual named Eddie Cerna in the Monterey County Jail. Brown Bob ended up escaping from the county jail, took off to Mexico, came back, and ended up getting caught up again. Another hit happened with an individual named Steve Reveles. I think it was in Santa Barbara County Jail. Tex Hernandez, who would become a future captain up in the 90s, as well as an individual named Lawrence Saldivar, were the ones that were found guilty of this crime. And as you see, the NF's position out there in the streets continued to kind of elevate. And there was a lot of murders that were occurring. Bugsy Sosa was actually killed. Now, there's speculation that Bobo actually had his brother killed. There was a whole lot of other things going on with Death Row Joe. All these hits and murders, the majority of them were being enforced by Death Row Joe. Now, one of the first individuals to ever flip seriously within the organization was an individual named Mousy Hernandez, who at that time was number 3 captain. The one that fulfilled his position after was Art Beltran, another captain who ended up flipping. So within the organization, you had a whole lot of what they were calling tyrants within the top of the brass, like Death Row Joe and Bobo Sosa. Some say that Bobo was pretty much naive to the things that were going on, but as a general, it was his responsibility to know. They said Death Row Joe had a lot of control over the money that was coming in from all these regiments, and that he would basically keep Bobo's beak wet, but at the same time was doing a whole lot of things. And when the indictments happened around 1977, 78, for a lot of murders that happened in Monterey County, all the way to, Bakersfield, Fresno, there was a whole lot of murders, and Fig got caught up in it, Perico got caught up in it, Death Row Joe ended up flipping. But in the process of Death Row Joe flipping, he tried to ask people for donations for his upcoming trial. So not only did he rob the NF of the bank, he also got donations on his way out flipping. And it became a big issue at that point. This is where Black Bob became a very influential member. Now, one more thing before we end this episode that became very crucial and critical later on. Sammy Venegas, around 1977, him and his mom were shot, or maybe it was 78. I get my years mixed up. As well as the NF also killed his brother. So there was also animosity between Sammy Venegas, who later on flipped in the 80s, but was also a big part of the change of the Bulldogs later on in the early 80s. With that said, man, we're going to be touching base on part 3, which is going to talk about the NF split, Bobo's demise, Black Bob's rise, and so forth, and how the different direction the NF went from here. So with that said, man, I did the best I could to give you guys clear facts or my understanding of how things were transpiring at that time. And we're on part 3 of the Nuestra Familia history. And what we're going to go into right now is at this time, late 70s, there was a lot of turmoil. A young future general had just hit the system at the age of 16. He was convicted of murder for killing a cab driver. After he'd done the killing, he went to the house, kind of told all his friends about it, and started trying to flush down all the bullet casings. Ended up getting caught. When he hit the system, he quickly aligned with the NF. Was put in a situation to where there was an individual that needed to go, was a very strong Bobo supporter, an individual named Kiki, who was also affiliated somehow with the Texas Syndicate. Now he was gay, and the NF had tried to move on this dude numerous times. And I guess one of the things that was being put out there was anybody who brought this man to the justice that the NF wanted would be granted membership into the NF. And so Corny went about his business, ended up dealing with this dude. And I think he was at the young age, about 16, 17 years old when he caught his second murder already. From there, a lot of stuff was going on. Like I said, with Bobo, Death Row Joe, new indictments that came out, a lot of NF members had been flipping. And this brought a lot of dissension within the organization. And two of the key individuals that were pushing against Bobo for his impeachment was Robert Black Bob Vasquez and Ezekiel Lopez. Now, Ezekiel Lopez, also known as Conejo, was Black Bob's actual brother-in-law. Now, they were calling for his impeachment and to strip the whole Constitution and change it to a whole other direction. Now, this caught a very big split within the NF at that time, around 1979 to 1980. They started to separate them on different tiers. They were going at it. A lot of politics were being played. Bobo sure had a lot of the old-time support, but Black Bob had this new wave of support, which included individuals like Corny, Pinky, Hobo, Manzana, and a whole lot of other individuals. Now, they ended up killing an individual named T-Bone from Salinas, who also went by Sailor Boy, okay? Corny and an individual named Poppy were the ones that ended up taking this individual out. Apparently, they stuck a rod all the way through his damn head, and he died. This was Corny's second hit for the NF and third NF hit that he had in total. Now, as all this friction and tension was going on, one of the things that helped, I think, kind of take the NF to a whole different direction was the indictments that Bobo was facing around that time era. Now, this is also the same time when there was a current new development with the North Daniels at that time. Late 70s, around 79, I believe. Where before that, you had individuals that from down south who were starting to bang Sureños. They were starting to target individuals that were from up north in rural areas because a lot of the NF members were locked down. Now, this is where you ended up having individuals who came in to intervene upon that behalf and to start lacing these North Daniels. Like I said in the previous segment. Now, they took the 14 Rules of a Warrior, which was written years ago, and they adapted that into some 14 bonds, and then they created a format and so forth. And there had been talks about establishing a new sub-faction, Farm Team, which got shot down originally. But they were still acknowledging these North Daniels. And the first term of them being recognized was under the XIV structure of North Daniels, because XIV, they fell under the 14 bond structure. They were organized in North Daniels. They were from up north. This is where the split occurred. Now, a lot of those within the this new North Daniel wave started to affiliate, of course, with the Black Bob faction and Brown Bob faction, and this is where a lot of the changes were starting to be implemented. You had a couple other individuals that just started hitting the system. Skip Villanueva, who came from YA, he was instantly pulled by Chente Orojo from Chino and Pinky Hernandez. They seen something in him, they recruited him, and he's lived up to every expectation set forth. But they also employed him as an undercover. Corny was an undercover till he did that last hit. Now, as the tensions arised, eventually the Black Bob faction won. And see, Black Bob, to me, is probably one of the most influential NF members maybe in history. Okay, the reason why I say that is because in a time of turmoil, dissension, and conflict within the organization, he was able to bring it all back together within like about a year or two, to where he created a whole thing which you called the NF Mesa, right? And then they changed it to the OGB, created the CAT system. And see, Black Bob could have easily probably put himself in position to be the general at that time, the sole general. But he felt that there needed to be more checks and balances within the organization. So you didn't have a scenario of Death Row Joe and Bible. So that's why the Constitution was pretty much revised and a lot of new changes were implemented in it. Now, at that time, the majority of the NF members were locked down, like I said, in the hole. And they had undercovers out there in the line. Now, there was an individual named Ricardo London out of Sacramento who was, I've also heard that he was also originally from down south, but he used to say he was from Sac. He was part of a lot of different radical movements, groups, and so forth. He was placed in charge of not only the undercover carnals, but under the new structure that was developed. And he wasn't even an NF member, but he was that intelligent, that vicious, and that with the business. He was almost about as tall as me. You know, I personally met him years later. So as that was developing, as we already know, the bonds and formats started to be created because they took everybody from that were all in these different facilities and they moved them all to Folsom. So they called it the Folsom Six, which were 6 individuals that were classified as leadership positions, which would have been Black Bob, Manzanas, Wolfie Prado from Morgan Hill, Corning, Pinky, and Chente Rojo. Those were the 6 that were considered leadership positions at that time, as far as in Folsom. Now, over there in DVI at that time, you had Hobo that was in charge, as well as the Gabriel brothers. They were the ones that were operating the functions for the NF at that time. Now, they were all slammed down. They were moved to a whole different facilities. And this is where the Norteño movement started to take course on the lines. Whereas opposed in the 70s, they had a little bit more wiggle room and access. Now they were more completely shut down. Okay, so the 80s is a very interesting time frame. You had Copas, Manos from Santa Barbara, Brown Bob, and Corny, as well as Black Bob signing off on it when they created the Nuestra Raza, which was known as Structure in the beginning. It came out probably about 83. There's no official dates. And as that developed, they started to implement new things within it. They also had their CAT system, which was a CAT 1 new recruit, CAT 2 squad leader to teacher, and then CAT 3, which would be an undercover carnal. And this is how they would have their rosters full of CAT statuses. But see, there was not enough checks and balances to verify certain individuals' ranks out there on these lines. And so 80s was a time when we started to lose a lot of the strongholds down south. A lot of individuals fell off. You had Baby Ray from Bakersfield, who at one time is believed to be one of the first members on the Mesa that was created. You had Brown Bob, who was sent into position. All these other leaderships, Chente Rojo. But when the north-south split started to occur, the NF started to focus solely on the issues that were going on with the Norteños. Therefore, they lost a lot of their strongholds in Santa Barbara, San Diego, and so forth. And a lot of that can be paid tribute to the indictments that ended up occurring with a lot of the old leadership. So now they had very few influential members that were from down south, but they still had, quite a few. Now, also in the late 70s, man, there was a case that was involving Pinky, DC, Sammy Dominguez, Sammy Venegas, the Vindiolas, and a couple other individuals, where they headed out on Memorial Weekend to try to check out Chalo Hernandez, as well as anybody else that was there. They were labeling them as NF hermits. In the process of this, somehow that information got back to Chalo. They were prepared. There was 2 shootouts that weekend within a short time frame. In the process, 1 civilian who was on leave from military deployed, as well as an NF member named Chipmunk Morris, I believe, that was killed in this crossfires. DC was also shot. David Bautista was also shot, who was an NF dropout who just passed away. Rest in peace, David. He's actually gave me a little information about this story. And that's how their cases were established in the beginning. From there, like I said, man, this is the new wave of leadership that came into the system. Corning, DC, Tex, Goldboss. MC was already influential at that time. He came in the system around 76. And the NFs was going pretty much underground. When they kind of restructured everything, Black Bob got released, went out to Arizona, stayed in contact with the Familia, but pretty much went his own way in some senses. And it's kind of interesting because if Black Bob was in it just for the glory and the recognition and the power and the money, he would have appointed himself as a general, but he didn't. It's like he came in, he fixed what he was part of, what he had been involved in for years, and then pretty much decided to kind of go his own way. There's been rumors that even they feel like he's a sleeper that's still been in contact all these years. That's just speculation of rumors. I don't believe it to be true, but I have heard that account. You also had other individuals that hit the system. Andrew Mad Dog Cervantes, who was in San Quentin at the time, who was calling for more recruitment into the YAs and into the Stockton area, which eventually he was able to establish regiments out there in Stockton under the gang Little Unity. Little Unity was kind of like the Chino Sinners of their time era, trying to run interference. But Little Unity, they were training them to be baby carnals. They were teaching them how to do armored truck robberies, bank robberies, and so forth. And they were a very influential hood in the 1980s. That it was believed that Stockton on the streets at that time may have been headquarters for all the stuff that was going on in San Jose, Fresno, and all these other areas. That Stockton was starting to be recognized as a headquarters out there on the streets. You had individuals like Chino that was out there. What's his name? Chapo was out there. Macaron, another influential. He was an education lieutenant. He's the one that brought the NF into different dynamics of their education as far as weaponry and so forth. And see, there was a lot of key players at this time era, you know what I mean, that continued this trend of pushing the NF agenda. But little was known about the 80s. It was a real quiet time. Even for the MA, it was real quiet. So it was mainly the Norteños structure, the Sureños, that were out there pushing those lines, that were going into war, that were fighting over these lines. And it was a whole different, a whole different cause was developed because there was a whole lot of more masses of numbers. Whereas before, back in the days, the prisons weren't as overpopulated, and the membership within these groups were a lot less. And the rackets were different. Instead of them trying to control the rackets, they were just trying to control the yard for their presence out there. You know, now Skip, Dancing Bear, a couple other individuals, Wino Perez, were very influential members early on the days in San Quentin, going out there, getting off, handling their business. Skip and DB were basically undercover carnals that were out there pushing the bonds and formats as structure members. Now, they did this to try to continue to promote, you know what I'm saying, the Northern structure. Because if they were to be recognized as NF members, it may have pushed a little bit of people away. So a lot of people were embracing this new concept that, you know, we're structure, which eventually later on down the lines around 89, I believe, 90, it started to adapt the term Nuestra Raza, NR. And this is where a lot of changes started to occur around 91 and 92, but we'll get to that later. But all throughout the 80s, a lot of individuals fell off. The whole Bobble, Brown Bob, Black Bob split left a lot of members walking away. Now, we also had a relationship as far as the NF with the Texas Syndicate for a minute, but they even had a split. They had some who were siding with the North, some that were siding with the South, and some that stayed neutral. We tried to have an established agreement, but the NF started to see a lot of deviant ways and scandalous ways in their actions. Colpas was the one that was able to pull them in the fold back then from Salinas. In addition to that, you know, you had people like Big Smiley that entered the system in the 70s, but were starting to push their name out there. And it's alleged that Big Smiley may have been one who was brought back because when they had the split, those that left the NF, they had a reentry program where they were welcomed back. My understanding that no one ever came back, but a lot of people say that Big Smiley may have been one possible individual that came back. But from what I've also heard was that The reason why that rumor's been put out there is that he was MIA for a minute. You know what I'm saying? He was working with different individuals in Chicago, as well as some Colombians that were plugged in through family resources as well as through NF resources. And a lot of business transactions were going on, you know. I think that the low level of attention was able for them to start building up their numbers and so forth. And with the split, they went from being a very deep organization to being low in numbers. I'd say at that time they probably had only maybe about 60 to 70 members, and they were mainly back in the shoe. And so this new wave of structure came through. This allowed them to find those individuals that they could pull into the fold, you know. Anyways, this is my era from around this late 70s to 1980s. Like I said, there's not a whole lot of known personal history as far as NF structure. There is the Nuestra Raza. A lot of fights were going on. They were battling for these yards. But the NF started to go kind of, like I said, not incommunicado from the rest of the main lines, but their business wasn't being as exposed as much because you had a new kid on the block. You know what I mean? The Sureños in structure. So they were getting all the attention because this was all new to staff at that time. You know, I know many people have asked about the color split. A lot of that was CDC created, where they started to give people certain findings when they got off the bus and identifying individuals. And see, that continued to translate further to where those colors were adapted for different meanings. Now, we also have the integrated yards that started to occur back around 88, 89 in Corcoran Shoe. And that's when a lot of individuals were being brought from all these lockup units, Folsom, San Quentin, DVI, Soledad, Chino, wherever they were at, and all brought there into one place. It was battle time at that time. You know what I mean? A lot of MA, a lot of Sureños, a lot of structure, a lot of NF members were straight going at it, straight war for about, I'd say about for at least 5 years, continuous conflict because they were integrating those yards deliberately. A lot of people lost their lives. A lot of people got shot. It was just the way of life at that time. And I think at that point forward, it was, those were like the last main issues of conflict between any NF and MA members. It was probably back in the 80s, maybe early 90s on those integrated yard. But before that, it was kind of a slow process. I mean, there wasn't too many hits going down because they were all separated. And if they were small skirmishes. You know what I mean? Maybe someone got poked real quick, you know, the guard set something up. But other than that, you know, they were all locked down. The title is the Nuestra Familia, part 4 of the history. And we're going to touch base basically up on the 1990s, which was a very crazy time, man. A lot of changes were going on within a 10-year span, which led us up to the Operation Black Widow. One of the main things during the 90s was when an individual named Louis Dump Truck Chavez paroled from Tehachapi Shoe with directives from Vicente Chente Arrojo from Chino and Joseph Pinky Hernandez from Rancho Cucamonga. He was supposed to go out there and become the head security department of the regiment out there in San Jose, which was almost kind of like being a regiment commander. He had a hit list, and immediately he turned that hit list into his parole agent upon parole. Thought that was a kind of unique situation when I read that upon the transcripts. And, you know, at this time, this is when you first started to also hear about the structure becoming the Nuestra Raza. This is when they eliminated the previous CAT system that they had, which was CAT 1, which was your indoctrination as a structure member. CAT 2, which was a squad leader leadership position, you know what I'm saying? And then CAT 3 were basically undercover carnales. They stripped that when the Pelican Bay opened up, changed the new chain of command for the Nuestra Raza, which consisted of a NRC, Nuestra Raza Council, which was similar to the NF's OGB, except for they put those in position were 2 undercover Cs, and Lalo from Parler and Pizza from Stockton. And then you had Nuestra Raza administrators, which were in charge of a particular unit at Pelican Bay, but their responsibilities were also to filter out directives to those that they were in contact with. They were basically what you would call a channel. Then you had your NRTs, which were the Nuestra Raza teachers and maestros, who created the curriculum for the NR movement, as well as conducted these investigations. After getting all information, they provided these facts, which got filtered on up for decisions to be made. So that was a big change. And like I said, the San Jose issues, we all know what's going to happen here. A lot of individuals started to get hit out there on the streets. Immediately, Lucky Shelton ended up taking over the position of head of security out there in the streets from the dump truck. It was actually Mad Dog Cervantes, right? Who actually, this goes to show you how much influence Stockton Regiment has. He went to a meeting at a female named Lisa Cuevas' house and basically stripped and demoted a dump truck from his position and put Lucky in. And this is where the murder spree just started to happen. And one of the first murder incidents that happened at that time was an individual named Tony Weasel Herrera. Okay. There was a meeting with Dump Truck, Silent Lopez, and I think a couple others, as well as a big-time PCP dealer and manufacturer named John Blanco. Everybody knows about the Blancos in San Jose. They were moving a lot of PCP, and they were well connected to the NF. And he was believing that this individual, Weasel, was basically telling on Blanco's operations. And so based upon one individual who's particularly paying and the other who's not really doing anything, the hit was ordered on him. They ended up having to, the way they got him was crazy. You know what I'm saying? First, they roll up on him, Spankeel, Silent, and Sheldon. And Spankeel gets out in the 38. I don't know how it jams. You know what I'm saying? I don't know if it was a firing pin or whatnot. It didn't work. So Silent goes and tackles the guy. And that's when Lucky came in and put 6 bullets in the dude. Then Huevo's going to start to work. They put 2 more. Okay. That created a whole lot of havoc out there in the streets, that you had another individual that was basically bad-mouthing the NF. That they ordered another green light on that individual. So you start to have different hits. Weddle, Urlango from Stockton was hit by the NF based upon the fact that he was disrespecting them. He had been holding 2 guns of the NFs for 2 grams of PCP that was owed. So instead of paying them back the 2 grams for the PCP, they elected to whack his ass. Another individual named Larry Valles, okay? He was an aspiring boxer out there. Had potential, they say. He ended up getting killed because of he was not willing to pay 25% of his illicit activities. And see, the hits kept on going on in just this fashion that I'm explaining. And then you had other people that were put in position. Bobby gets locked up. They end up hitting his old lady, which Bobby gave the green light, which he had a very hard time doing, according to a former NF member named Robert Rabbit Rios. But it got done. And then Chocolate Perez got hit. Other individuals just started to come up dead that were not even tied in to this NF indictment that ended up being handed out around 1992-93. Several individuals were indicted. Pinky was indicted. Chente Rojo was indicted. Eddie Vargas, Pajo, and Flaco. Spankeel, Huevo, Silent, Leo. Like I said, all these individuals were put up on this indictment. And a lot of people flipped. It took the NF in a whole totally different direction as far as what was really going on, as far as that individuals did not know who to trust. And so many people also were getting killed that, like I said, were not even involved in this case or being charged with. Like Paul Farfan was another one that got killed out in the streets. A good dude, but this shit got personal. And this is where everything started to kind of change. And they put a stain basically upon the San Jose Regiment because they've had past indictments where they've had several people flip, like Death Row Joe, Art Beltran, and so forth in the 80s. But this is the first time you had a major indictment pertaining to one city where you had so many, co-defendants, and so many of them just flipped to get better deals. And as we know, the ending route of what led after trial was a death row sentence for 3 individuals, Spankeel, Huevo, and Silent. Now, what I haven't mentioned so far is that Andrew Mad Dog Cervantes was the very few people who was also charged Santa Clara County on an indictment, and then he got federally RICO'd enterprised over here in Stockton, which led to him doing this long extensive fed time. So as after the trial where these guys get sentenced to death row, a lot of changes starts coming out from up there in Pelican Bay. You have just currently had the D facility dilemmas, which was between Smiley and Pantera. Smiley was basically going against Corny at that time, and Pantera, but to uphold his position. He felt that he had more respect coming, long-term member, and so forth. So he was pushing the issue. Bandera fought back. And there was a lot of crazy stuff going on at that time, which kind of took the NR and NF in a whole different direction, because the NR, a lot of brothers were getting deemed no good for getting involved in NF business. And this is why I used to always emphasize that in a lot of videos before when we were hearing about the state and Fed issue. NF business is NF business. Don't involve any NR members or Norteño members in it, because the consequences for them, they don't know what they could be, because you're just following orders, responsible obedience. And so that's where a lot of NR members fell off. And this is around that time when you had a filter come out called the Salutations 497 filter, which addressed the dismantling of the Nuestra Raza, terms like hermano and bro, in the title Norteño Soldados being taken over. Now, this took a few years to get out there, but they also had another policy coming out, which was the red on red policy, which gave everyone out there that was an affiliated Norteño the guided procedures of what they were expected now. There was to be no more red on red set tripping, violence, tagging other people's neighborhoods. Respect was supposed to be shown. And further orders were told that they had to start knocking Sureños out there in the streets. They wanted blood to be shed. And see, this is around the same time that the GUN CD came out, by an NF member named Huerito from Modesto. And, that CD had a lot of influence out there in the streets. And I think the NF's whole sole objective for it was to unite the masses. Because when you're united, whether you get along or not, it's all about this money. Because previously, all gangs out there in Northern California, they gangbanged. Some of them made money, but very few. It was more about gangbanging. Now everything was just all becoming about money. And this is when you had the issues out there in Salinas between, basically it was a power struggle up there in the Bay between Tex and Cuete. And Tex actually gave a green light upon MC Mike Castillo before the vote went through. Now, that was a very, very deep issue. Copas was out there too. He was the MC supporter. He actually got deemed no good for a minute. I think he's still no good. Paki also was a Copas supporter. And he let the NF members know up there in the Bay that he stood with Copas, which put him in a bad situation for a minute. A lot of people ended up getting killed. Salvador Littleman Castaneda, who was related to Pablo Castaneda, who they wanted to hit out there in the streets. He was killed the moment he got out of San Quentin, found in an orchard with a 1-3 being thrown up. Okay. Now, during these death row trials, like I said, you had a high-ranking member flip, Chente Arrojo. That has to be emphasized because that left a whole other seat vacant for general position. Now, this is when Brown Bob started coming back into the fold too, when he went up to the Bay and he was allegedly celled up with Big Smiley before all these issues came about. And some of the things that he was doing put a dark cloud over him. The Mothers Against Gangs, speaking at those engagements, and, supposed to be put on semi-retirement. They warned him several times, like they did MC, that, there's a hit on you. MC's response was, cops lies. Basically telling the cops, I don't believe shit you say. Brown Bob didn't take it serious either. And then that's when on April 19th, 1999, they end up coming in and taking out Brown Bob. David Escamilla and Santos Bad Boy Bernias from Corcoran. Dreamer was actually from East Side Hood, San Jose. Chuco Guillen was down the street observing the hit. And this led to even more issues because the dude that had got the car forgot to set the car on fire or get rid of the fingerprints. So they ended up having to have him whacked. Dreamer Escamilla ended up killing him. Okay, so as you know, you had the MC murder, you had the Geronimo murder, you had all this stuff going on out there in the streets, man. Salinas was basically at war with each other, which you think with the chain of command structure that the NF has, that this would never ever occur, but it did. Now, one hit that goes unnoticed that was an NF hit was regarding a certain cartel individual that was out there in Santa Rosa that was robbed by some individuals that he met through an individual named Javier Flaco Subiate. Now, Flaco Subiate became an NF member. This individual, I've been told by people that they thought that he was one of the firmest true believers there was. So when these dudes did this to this cartel member, right, that was basically paying contributions to the NF for protection, Flaco went and handled his business and ended up killing one of them. You know, the funny thing about it is he was running across the freeway, excuse me, and he got stopped by I think it was Detective Collard, you know, out of all people. And when they were searching him and they heard about the shooting and so forth, they found a bundle of money. And it was said that Flacco immediately said that, you know, why did you have this money? He said that this was for his kid's college fund. So I thought that was kind of interesting. But during this time era, like I said, man, you know, the NR was doing a lot of the bidding for the NF. You know what I'm saying? There was a lot of hits that the NR were involved in, and others like Stockton, Tulare County, Modesto, and so forth. As well as this was a time era when, you know, I didn't really mention too much about the Bulldogs in the 80s, but I will a little bit. The Bulldogs' official date is somewhere between 83 and 84, you know, where they had their first council and so forth. And but there was still the Fresno part that time afterwards. There wasn't a total divide, but they had influence from certain ex-NF members like Crackers Vindiola, Sammy Venegas, and so forth. Around 92, well, they say around the date of 88 is when the green light was put on the Bulldogs. But by 92, that was fully enforced everywhere, including YA. And this is where the Norteño plight continued. The Nuestra Familia had gained members. They've been dismantled, like I previously discussed. And like I said, San Jose had a very dark stain on their jacket based upon the early indictments. Salinas was having issues based upon the MC murder and the power struggle with the C's out there. And there was a lot of stuff going on at Pelican Bay, man. A lot of allegations. Bravas was caught up for a minute. There was allegations of him allegedly some stuff going on that wasn't inappropriate in the cell. And some other issues, man. You know, and Black Jess from Gomez, from Salinas. He's the one that tried to create that peace treaty up there in the Bay between the Mexican Mafia and the NF. They ended up deeming him no good. So you had a lot of members at this time that had so much influence for so many years that were falling out, you know. And this is where the old just, you know, entered into that new reign, which we've already discussed several times as far as Operation Black Widow. You know, the early investigations started to occur in 1998 concerning several murders that were NF related out there in Santa Rosa. And that's where they employed one of their first informants that wasn't necessarily a NF associate or member, but ended up tying them in to an NF associate. And, you know, a lot of stuff was going on, you know. Rojo was out there active at that time. I was locked up getting out, but I heard about all the stuff that was going on. And there was so much turmoil and internal power struggles in all kinds of areas. It made a lot of homeboys have distrust for the O at that time. You know, and the CD push, that kind of changed everything too, the GUN and the new revisals and the red on red. And this is where the NF entered into a whole different domain of influencing the hoods to make that money. Anyways, this is part 4, and I'm gonna do this as the last installment because everything else we've kind of kept current. There's still a lot of stuff that I probably am forgetting because I'm going off the top of my head. But this was a time era, man. Like I said, the 90s is where the NF tried to make a stance back. The 80s, they kind of, after the split between Black Bob and Bobo and so forth, they were kind of how you say it, going undercover. You know, their activities weren't as known. I mean, you had Little Unity, had a lot of influence out there in the streets. Stockton was almost recognized as a headquarters for a minute. And I think when they started sending everybody to Pelican Bay, the communications got a whole lot different, you know. And this is where all these organizations continued, you know. Anyways, this is a quick spill. NF, Nuestra Familia History Part 4. If you haven't heard all the other ones, check them out, man.